Behold, my glorious supporter, EyePatchNotes, has requested a very difficult, challenging parlay, a really interesting parlay about players as architects. There's a lot here. I think that when I read it the first time, you're going to be confused, and I'm even a little confused, but I'm pretty sure I know what you're talking about, and it's a really interesting topic as long as I'm not completely wrong. So let's go through it. If you're confused, just hold on. I'll see what I can do to catch us all up, and then we'll talk about it. A very interesting aspect of game design. EyePatchNotes says, may I request a discussion on the perspective of players as architects in buildcraft? You most certainly may. Players can be seen as the nth architect of an established work. The foundation is laid and immutable outside of starting anew. In this way, buildcraft pillars are what the developers put down and what players build around or on top of. So to briefly stop here for just a moment, in case that confused you, because it initially confused me, I don't think you've worded this badly. I think that this is a complicated topic. The idea here is that making a video game is a collaboration between the players and the developers. It's a weird collaboration because the developers are essentially laying down a framework that, we'll get to that pun. You made that pun too, but I swear that was by accident. A framework that encourages the player to make a certain kind of game out of the framework that's there. So in other words, many games, almost all games, to some degree, and it depends on the game how much to a degree, are encouraging the player, nudging the player to play the game in a certain way, or to make a certain complete game out of the parts that the developers put into the game with which you could construct fun. Right? Anyway, moving along. We can use this mental model or framework, that was EyePatchNotes making the joke that I just accidentally, but I've done a few takes of this, made. We can use this mental model to suggest that pillars can be measured on spectrums of proximity, explicit synergies, that is, how obvious is the thing that the developers put in the game? How much are the developers hoping you discover the thing? And how much do the developers just tell you that the thing is there? I'll give you examples of that in a minute. Size, tactical benefit. So in other words, things put in the game, just how relevant are they? How much do you care that this thing is more effective in this situation or not, or whatever? How much is it that kind of game? And stability, value to the player. This one I'm having a little bit more trouble with, but to me the idea is sort of like, how much does it matter to do better in a fight, for example? In a given game, like, does completing the mission faster confer some benefit? Does being safer matter that much? How big of a deal is it to die? And so how much do you care about that thing? That was my assumption. Robust game architecture has a balanced combination of the above three qualities. Large discrepancies can lean to the player, item, or ability feeling bad or misguided. Right, so the idea here, there's more of this, but I'm going to stop here and talk about this stuff for a little bit. There's more of this, but the idea is, I would agree with EyePatchNotes that we would argue that good game design involves some obvious synergies and some less obvious synergies. Some things that matter a lot and some things that matter a little. Some things that are really important to keep in mind and some things that you could care about and gain a benefit, but it's not a huge deal, right? And a blend of those things is good. Having something that is kind of on the same station as other things, having many weapon choices, but then one of them just like doesn't seem to care about these principles, that feels bad a lot of the time. It makes the choice, the weapon, the class, the warframe, the character, the whatever, I'll get into examples in a minute, feel kind of awkward, like it's not fully realized in the game. Why is this one thing so, I might use the word underdeveloped? It kind of feels like this wasn't positioned as carefully on the chessboard of the game design, right? Let's give you a bunch of examples, because I imagine, although we're not super far into this video, it's still been 4 minutes and we're just talking about the question. It's a complicated thing. You are perfectly fine to be confused. Let me give you some examples. So we're talking about these things about proximity, size, and stability in buildcraft. I'm going to talk about Genshin Impact, Warframe, and Hades as examples. In these games, there are various, I'm just going to call them classes as a catch-all term, but what that means in these various games differs. In Genshin Impact, the class you're picking, that vague idea of a class, translates into this game pretty indirectly as what characters you choose. choose? What 4 characters am I going to put on my team at any given time? For you will always have, well, not always, but pretty much always have more than 4 choices. What weapons will they use? What different elements do those characters have? Why? What benefits do they confer, and why do I want those things? In Warframe, you're picking what Warframe do I want to use with what weapons, and again, why. And in Hades, you pick what weapon you want to use, maybe what Mirror of Night and Pact of Punishment modifiers, what Keepsake, and what Chthonic Companion, right? You pick these things. And for those to be interesting, satisfying choices, for in all 3 of these games, you at least can choose those things very often. So it's really important that those choices matter. Otherwise, the developers making new stuff won't be interesting because you don't care about changing your mind. And it's also silly if you just like changing your mind. If you like to choose different options, which a lot of people do to some extent, and I do to a huge extent because that's basically what buildcraft is, it's not going to be fun unless the motivations that the player will have to change their mind will be different. To back up to a higher level for a second here, this means that the developer has to strike a balance between, okay, it's impossible for us to prophesize the entire meta of this game or the perceived metagame. The developer can't look at all the Warframes in Warframe and perfectly predict exactly why you'd want to use all of them. But at the same time, the developer can trivially easily put some effort into making sure they're not like exactly the same as each other. You get the idea. And depending on the developer and the game, it may be easier or harder to do that, and the developer just might choose to do more or less of it. So for example, in Warframe, you might not agree that the different Warframes are very well balanced with each other, but now that I'm prompting you to think about it, I think you would agree that the developer has obviously put some effort into making sure the Warframes are not the same, right? There's not a huge amount of overlap between Warframes. There are only a few Warframes that feel very similar, and even then, they do have some different uses. A lot of the time, those were earlier in time Warframes. Just as a very quick example, I would say like Ashe and Loki are a little similar, right? But even then, they play differently. It's fine that they're both in the game. They are a touch similar, yeah. They both have a similar, not the same, but similar invisibility ability, and a similar, not the same, but similar teleport. They're both like ninjas. I mean, it's a space ninja game, but anyway, you know. Another example in Genshin Impact, the upcoming character Yanfei is very similar to Ningguang, but she's Pyro. They're both catalyst users that do normal attacks to build up a more powerful charge attack that they use much more frequently than other characters might, in a certain rhythm where other characters might not. They're a very primary attacker with a catalyst that is throwing chunks of their element, and then they get charges to do the thing. They are very similar. The core idea is extremely similar, but nevertheless, they are a little different, and that is meaningful. Being Pyro instead of Geo has a lot of implications for Yanfei being better and worse in various ways than Ningguang is at doing the things that Ningguang can do. There are also, of course, some actual differences, you know. Anyway, and in Hades, there are various ways in which, for example, the sword and the spear can feel similar, and that they both don't hit very infrequently or very frequently. They have a pretty rounded, no matter what aspect of them you're using, they usually have a pretty even split of hitting rapidly and hitting for a lot of damage but more slowly. And in Hades, a lot of boon design is built around this being good if the weapon hits slowly for a lot of damage, or this being good if the weapon hits quickly for a little damage. And the spear and the sword, the first 2 weapons you get, are, no surprise, kind of in the middle there, so that it's not as big a deal which boons you pick when you're learning how to play the game. That being said, it does make them on the surface a bit similar, and so you'll notice that 4 melee weapons for just a straightforward, like it's a stereotypical melee weapon, a sword and a spear, probably the most normal weapons in Hades, the aspects of the sword and the spear are pretty different from each other. There are very few similarities between any aspects of the sword and the spear, even more so than other weapons, which do have some similarities. The shield and the bow are pretty different weapons, but the aspect of Hera and the aspect of Beowulf are relatively similar. It's the same core idea. I love those aspects. I don't think they're a bad part of the game, but they are relatively similar. Anyway, moving on. So that idea, right? To varying degrees, the developer cares about, or is even able to, because it might be harder or easier in a given game, to make you choose, to switch to something else. And obviously, for various reasons in various games, the developer wants to make more money. The developer doesn't want you to get burned out. The developer has cool toys they want you to try. The developer has a motivation to make you want to at least try something different, right? And all these games have different ways of doing that as well. In Hades, we have a really simple one. Now, Hades, you buy it and then you have it. So the game, there's a way in which you might think, well, they don't need to care if you only try one weapon and get burnt out and stop playing, because all the financial benefit is there, right? But Supergiant is a studio that is really built on reputation in a lot of ways, and many more people than average know and like Supergiant as a game developer. I don't know, that's not supported by data that I'm aware of. I'm just predicting. I've noticed that a lot of people who don't know about game studios do know the name of this studio, because they're so consistently nice. They have a really distinct flavor as a game developer. They're very kind. They're not about losing or winning. They're not about wrong or right. The timer they put in Hades waits for you while you pick a boon. They just have this kindness in the game development that isn't necessarily all good. It's debatable. I like that style of game development, but it's not objectively the best. It's just very noticeable, is all I'm trying to say. Anyway, the point of that is that you might think they don't have any motivation to do that, but Supergiant is a studio that simply wants you to have fun with the game. They want you to enjoy the game. They're just a genuine, kind-hearted game developer, as near as I and everybody else can tell. And so we have the Dark Thirst mechanic. When you start a run in Hades, one of the 6 weapons, or whichever ones you have unlocked, will have a little buff that gives you more darkness and eventually more gems as well, if you choose that weapon. This is a minor benefit. It's meant to be something that you often don't really care whether you have, but it's a gentle nudge in the direction of, I don't know which weapon I want to pick. I'll pick this one because it has this small benefit. There is an objective benefit to choosing this as long as I do well, and I'm not sure which one to pick, so I'll just pick this. A little nudge, you see. In Genshin Impact, the nudges are a little bit more heavy-handed. Makes it sound bad. I don't think it's usually a bad thing, but Genshin Impact is a game that, of course, they make their money as a free-to-play game by you wanting different characters. So they have a much stronger motivation, a much stronger incentive to get you to want to at least have a lot of characters, which probably means switching between them. And thus the game is virtually built around the idea that you would care about having many, many different options for characters, no matter what kind of player you were. There are different elements, and environmental puzzles involve different elements. You might not have a pyro character on your team at the moment, but you need to light that torch, so you have to swap to a pyro character. We'll come back later to the idea of forcing the player to swap to things, because it's a pretty big deal in Genshin Impact and in Warframe, and almost completely not present. It's not really a thing in Hades, which is a big difference, and we'll talk about that. But anyway, for now, you might just need to swap. You might want to swap. You might be fighting an enemy, or know you're going to fight an enemy, or in a domain or a dungeon or something that you know is vulnerable to a certain element, or resistant to a certain element, or will have an element on them, and you want to pick which reaction you want to make with that element, or no reaction, possibly. Usually not, but sometimes. Maybe the domain has a condition that just punishes you for using a set element. So you're not forced to use an element, but you're kind of forced to not use a specific element, and then that has ripple effects. If the domain is pyro enemies, and the game tells you not to use hydro, which would be good because you'd get vaporize reactions against them that does a lot of damage, then you can choose electro or cryo if you want to react with that pyro in a stereotypical way. Swirl from Anemo won't really do damage, and Geo, we'll talk about that later, in some other video. I mean, it's not about Genshin Impact. But the point is, you might not want Electro and Pyro because that's overloaded and it throws enemies away, or you might really want it. Overloaded can stagger larger enemies, which can be valuable. If there's a lot of smaller enemies, you might prefer to choose Cryo if the game is telling you they're Pyro, so they won't take Pyro damage, and you can't use Hydro. So there's a lot of small enemies, so then the player thinks, okay, so I kind of can't use Electro either, so I'll pick Cryo, and that's why. And you can see there how the game didn't force you to pick Cryo, but obviously they're like sort of intending you to pick Cryo, and this is kind of the heart for me of this idea of game design as pillars, the idea that the game is nudging you in a certain direction. And Genshin Impact is a game that I think is a really good example of the developers doing this intentionally, very consistently. There are motivations from the developers quite consistently to make you do things like this, make you have thinking like this in a very good way. I think it adds a lot to the game. Warframe is a really good example here as well, and you singled it out because on the surface, Warframe is a game defined by the fact that I think the developers do very little to encourage you to play in a certain way. The mastery in Warframe, the mastery system. This is a system that rewards you. You unlock stuff, you get more capacity for Syndicate standing and Void stuff and whatever. You get a lot of things, you know, the overall account level upgrade when you try different weapons. So that's Warframe saying, okay, we vaguely want the player to try different weapons, right? And you can see why. Warframe is also a free-to-play game, and you can buy new weapons. It's a pay-to-skip model of a game. Most of you know that, but very different from Genshin Impact, which is has a largely gacha monetization system, or like a monthly fee system, but is also a free-to-play game at heart. They can both be played as free-to-play games, but if you don't play them free to play, your relationship to them is very different. They're not like the same kind of free to play game. And then Hades, you pay and then that's it, right? Anyway, just so they have a motivation to make you try different weapons, of course. Besides you just getting burnt, you know, it's fun to try different weapons, sure. Because of the mastery system. So on that surface level, the game is very generally nudging you to try different weapons, sure. You could argue, I'm not sure I would agree, but you could argue that mods as a design decision also indirectly encourage you to try different weapons. I think one strength of Warframe is that once you have mods, you can generally buildcraft pretty much everything in the game. Warframe is a weird game in that getting to the point where you have like meaningfully the buildcraft tools on the table takes a long time. It's not early on in Warframe that buildcraft is really relevant. It takes quite a while for it to like be a thing. This is kind of true in Hades too, for a different reason we might come back to later. It's not uncommon in games like this for the buildcraft to not show itself until a bit later, but Warframe is a relatively extreme example in that it takes a long time to get all the buildcraft tools assembled, but then once you have them, the game also opens up considerably more than most games where you get the buildcraft tools on the table, in that now that you have, you know, a fully ranked Hornet Strike, every single secondary you ever use now has more damage. That was the, you know, Hornet Strike ranking up is a progression mechanic. You put Endo into it, and now your secondaries just do more damage, right? Which I think is a pretty good thing about Warframe when you think of it that way. I understand why people don't like mandatory mods, but that's a discussion for another time. Consider that they do have benefits, and obviously we can talk about that more some other time if people are interested. Excuse me. Yes, Warframe has this character where it does vaguely, broadly encourage you and reward you, or the cost becomes lower and lower to try many different weapons, sure. But another thing that's true about Warframe is that it's a game where the Warframes, the various Warframes, are relatively unbalanced relative to each other, in that most of the time in Warframe, when something is worth using, it's not because it has competition, but it's well balanced with that competition. It's because it has no competition. Warframe is a game with many niches. There are many things that could be good, and Warframe has many weapons and Warframes that are good at those different things, but it's not particularly common for something to be in competition for the slot of like being good at this thing. Warframe is a game that generally simply makes an entirely new niche, and then something's good at that, rather than things effectively competing for that slot. So you, in some ways, don't make a lot of choices in Warframe if you have all the tools on the table. Generally, if you know of everything and you can use whatever you want, there is a very, very small pool of competitive choices, or maybe none at all. Let's get into the second half of this question, which is a good example of that. Regarding Warframe, EyePatchNotes says, 2020's Helminth system lends itself to this player's as architect's perspective. The 5 primary pillars are roughly a given Warframe's base stats and its 4 abilities. Players can detect and, more importantly, decide which pillars are of high or low priority to them. Right, so this is going in a different direction than I chose to talk about, but I hope that my groundwork will help in some way. This is such a huge topic. I hope I'm doing the best I can. The idea here is that as a player, the Helminth system invites you to kind of figure out what you want the Warframe to finally be on its own. If you take, say, Revenant. Revenant is a Warframe that you can view in a variety of ways. You could view Revenant, for various reasons, as being focused on creating thralls and executing them with % damage from Reeve. You could view Revenant as a Warframe that gets a lot of survivability for free, a very absolute form of defense with Mesmer Skin, and a really powerful AoE ability with his Death Carousel. You could view Revenant as being a pretty rounded Warframe or a very linear Warframe. You could consider that the way I think of Revenant, for example, is that Reeve is kind of the odd one out. Mesmer Skin is overpowered, and you can make it more powerful with strength, which makes his Death Carousel more powerful. Enemies that shoot you when you have Mesmer Skin up also open enemies to a free cast of your Enthrall ability. So if that's useful without Reeve, which I think it is, it's fine, especially if it's free to cast, then you can get rid of Reeve, and Revenant is doing most of what he can do effectively. I don't really need to use an ability to kill enemies. I can just use my powerful weapons, and so I don't mind if Reeve is not particularly good at killing enemies, provided I can do enough damage to them quickly to kill them with my weapons, which I can personally. Then I'll get rid of Reeve, and that's why. But many players could look at it different ways. I would definitely understand, and I probably will do this when I make videos about Revenant, replace his Death Carousel because it uses a lot of energy, and it's not weak, but I don't think that it's so powerful that I am willing to spend that much energy rather than just throwing my efficiency in the garbage and relying on Mesmer Skin and using some other ability that's maybe a little bit less energy hungry, sure. And so in that way, as EyePatchNotes is saying, you can kind of view the Warframe as Digital Extremes providing you with a starting point, and then you sort of finish the construction of that part of the game by picking what ability you're going to modify, if any. And the Warframes could be more or less designed to address that. Now, the Helminth system is pretty new in Warframe. This is a really good example of this topic. I love that you brought this up. So there's this interesting thing where most Warframes in Warframe weren't designed with it known that the Helminth system would exist. We just know pretty much for sure that they weren't thinking of doing the Helminth system from the very beginning of your time playing Warframe, in all likelihood. Maybe they were, but I doubt it. No offense whatsoever to the developers, that just seems unlikely. We don't know when or for how long, but certainly recent Warframes are much more specifically addressing the Helminth system. They have more complicated relationships with it. So Lavos, for example, Lavos has cooldowns instead of energy. When you give Lavos a Helminth ability, its energy cost becomes converted to a cooldown. That is a pretty unique relationship with the Helminth system. Lavos can also hold his default abilities to infuse his other default abilities with elements. But if you infuse an ability over a slot, you also lose the ability to infuse that element for his other abilities. Again, a pretty unique and non-basic consideration when you're putting a Helminth ability on Lavos, right? And so the developers have, whether intentionally or not, and we'll get back to that in a minute, created this interesting choice where the player could not think about that at all. The player could construct nothing of their own, and Lavos works. The developers made a Warframe that basically works and makes sense. You don't have to put any more buildcraft effort into Lavos, and Lavos is basically functional. But also, if you choose to add your own stuff, the developers have laid some groundwork for that to be an interesting, meaningful choice by making it so Lavos is a very powerful asset. You don't have to pay energy for the ability you infuse, but also a significant drawback. Your other abilities get in some way worse if you swap one of them out because you don't have as many options for elements on them. Catalyze does more damage if you have many elements, so that's a simple way in which you're certainly paying something. There's a cost. You're punished as well as potentially rewarded if you swap an ability off, right? Or you could swap off Catalyze and not care about that, sure. But you get that. That's an interesting motivation. The whole thing about efficiency behaving differently, and we won't get into it too much with Lavos, but that example, right? And then frames like Sevagoth, who has 2 different forms, and so you're swapping a bit. We won't get into that either, but anyway, the point is that is interesting in various ways that might feel more or less good. Now, Warframe is a really good example of this kind of stuff because we're in a position where many older Warframes feel like they have one ability that is just obviously what you replace most of the time. Now, you're talking to this guy, I can obviously think of a situation where you wouldn't replace any given ability, like on Nyx, Mind Control, but I can think of a build where you wouldn't want to replace Mind Control, like that. Trinity, Well of Life, but I can think of a build where you wouldn't want to replace Well of Life. There is a very obvious one to replace, but it's not the only ability you'd ever replace, period. It's kind of a boring decision, right? When I say that you could not replace it and gain something, I'm being devil's advocate. I don't think that is actually good advice. I don't really recommend that you do that, but it's a thing that you could choose to do, right? And so in that way, when EyePatchNotes, you say robust game architecture has a balanced combination of the above 3 qualities, large discrepancies in how much of a meaningful choice the thing is can lead to the character, item, or ability feeling bad or misguided. Why did they put Well of Life, an ability that gives you lifesteal, on a Warframe that has a button that fully heals your entire team? That just doesn't... Why? Why would you want that? And this is true a lot of times in Warframe. One of my largest criticisms of Warframe's design is that it kind of feels like they don't think about this topic we're talking about right now that much. They, like virtually every game developer in the world, are aware of it. They think about it some, but in Warframe, I believe it is unarguable that they don't think about it as much as would benefit the game. They would benefit. It would be better if our developers thought more about this thing that we're discussing right now. So, for example, there are many Warframes. Trinity was one example I gave, but there are lots. We can give many examples where they have multiple abilities that you'd think, why would it be particularly good to have these 2 abilities on the same Warframe? So an example I often complain about is Titania. Spellbind and Lantern are different abilities, and they're both potentially useful abilities, but they are also both, generally, you crowd control a group of enemies. Why does the one Warframe have 2 abilities like that? Why not put one of those abilities on a Warframe, or something similar to one of those abilities, on a Warframe that doesn't have that effect yet? Why give a Warframe 2 different ways to do almost the same thing, such that when you cast one, when you hit 1 or 3 on Titania, it now makes very little sense to click the other button? It just doesn't seem... It's not the end of the world. Some people like to have many versions of the same option, but it just feels like a weird use of design space. It doesn't entirely make sense. Misguided is the word that EyePatchNotes is using here, and I agree. I think that that's the exact word. It's not terrible. It's not game-breaking. Some people even like it, but from a game design perspective, there isn't really a clear reason why you would do that. It seems like another idea that is less overlapping with something the Warframe already has would make more sense, and has more of a chance when we kind of get into talking about fun, how you build craft fun. Fun is subjective, but it does correlate with various qualities. You can't just say this is objectively unfun. It can be less fun, though. You can predict that things will be on average more or less fun. Fun is not random, is the point. And one way that you can encourage fun to occur is to make there be a lot of different things that people would like. Make there be many options, or make a warframe do a variety of things. So if a player doesn't want area crowd control, some players in Warframe think crowd control is just a waste of time. So giving a Warframe 2 crowd control abilities is not as good in that sense as giving a Warframe 1 crowd control ability, because it makes the players that, sometimes incorrectly, but I get why, think that crowd control is not that good. It makes those players more likely to bounce off of that Warframe, right? That's not the only reason it might be a good decision. It's just an example. The point I'm trying to get at here is that there are a lot of Warframes in Warframe that they're designed as though not that much thought was given to this Warframe already has these things. So what would make it a more interesting decision which ability to use or which ability to replace? Giving them another ability like that, or giving them a more different ability? It would make more sense to give them a more different ability, like that, you know. I'll give one more quick example that came to mind. Nidus is a Warframe that is not bad or good in this way, but kind of interesting, because you need to use your abilities to build up stacks in order to use your other two abilities. So at first, when Nidus first came out, there wasn't any way to get stacks if you had no stacks, except using your first ability, which means that part of playing Nidus is a relatively uninteresting choice. You need to use your first ability, or you cannot use the other abilities. Now, Nidus' second ability can give you stacks as well. And so that's a choice. And then when you have some stacks, your third and fourth abilities can be used in various ways to get more stacks. Or you could use your existing abilities to get more stacks. And so that's kind of interesting, and it opens up. But you can see how Nidus was designed in a way that, to some degree, to a varying arguable degree, but to some degree, with it in mind that the player would want to not have to do the only one thing to build stacks, right? And again, even if you think that Warframe design is terrible, if you're somehow watching this and you absolutely despise Warframe and me, I think you will still agree upon inspection that Warframe designs have taken some thought to make sure that Warframes don't have completely redundant abilities. There are very few Warframes that have virtually the exact same ability in multiple slots. That there are maybe a few Warframes like that, but very few. It's very clear that they put some effort, just because it's obvious to put some effort into avoiding that thing, right? Okay, there's a third part that has spoilers, so I'm going to click them. And I'm going to read them, but that was my little spiel about that so far. That is what I think is the topic, and I haven't really said anything about it yet, which is going to make this an absurdly long discussion, but that's fine. It's a huge topic. I wish I was the kind of person who could do this faster. I can't. And so we'll go along for the ride, but I hope I explained it kind of well. The idea that there are many different motivations and knobs to turn to make something feel different, and a tapestry of different choices is desirable. I think that having an ability that is kind of obvious to replace with the helmet system, but there are reasons not to replace it, is potentially desirable. I think it's often good in game design where there's a fairly obvious good option if the player is at a loss, or you just to get them in the door, but then you need to make sure it's not too obvious. You want to make sure it feels like there's a point in thinking about a different decision. And then you should probably intentionally lay some groundwork for, okay, secretly, we think this is a good option to replace. Let's put in some things so the player, might get there. Or if they do choose to do that, they have a nice surprise. It really fits. It works well, right? From there. There's whole other topics in here that I've talked about a lot before, so I'm kind of going to gloss over, about things like having meaningful choices in a slot. So for example, in Warframe, we have the weapon Excellus slot, which can't contain mods that increase damage. Why would that be bad? You might be thinking that's really good, but you would be wrong. The reason that's not good is because you would just put that mod in every time. If you could put reload speed mods into the weapon Excellus slot, it would be mathematically correct to do that on virtually every weapon in the game, because that, unlike almost every other mod you can put in that slot, increases the weapon's damage. And so the weapon is objectively less powerful most of the time unless you use that one thing. They could put all of those options in the weapon Excellus slot, and then it would be a meaningful choice, but we'd have more mod slots, which makes more mandatory mods rather than less. More mod slots might seem like a good solution, but it isn't. It just means that you're going to want to use 9 set mods instead of 8. That's probably why they wisely chose to make sure you can't put any mods people already want to use into the Weapon Excellence slot, which is why a lot of people don't like it. But it would have been a mistake to do it a different way. They were just kind of stuck. It was a weird idea. I like the Weapon Excellence slot personally because I understand it, and I wasn't looking for more mod slots, but there's a bit of an oubliette there, and that's why. And there are also factors like, when a player goes into a mission, they want to see their decision rewarded, either with just good damage, or if they picked something more specific, it's fulfilling to see that work and do something valuable. It's interesting intellectually, but not fun to see the thing that you were trying out be ineffective. And so having effectiveness considerations be rewarded, having the game respond be different, much easier or harder depending on what you choose, usually feels good. Exactly how you do that, what specific thing, how much you consider that for a specific mission, and how much you just want the player to vaguely do a good job making a powerful build can vary depending on the game. Let's read the end of this parlay. EyePatchNotes says, regarding house rules, mods, and vision. Games seek to be fun, enriching experiences. Fudging a few rules or restrictions can add to accessibility. Like fan-made works, though, the developer's original intent can get buried under custom content. True buildcraft to me involves playing the game as close to form as possible. Ooh, I have a lot of things to say about that. I'm gonna stop before I'm gonna stop. There's one more part that's really interesting, but I want to talk about this part first. So, to me, one really interesting aspect of this topic we're talking about is the degree to which the player feels like they completed the design of the game versus just kind of the game being a curated experience of the player completing the design. So for example, in Risk of Rain 2, I think Risk of Rain 2 is a great game, but I have a lot of mods on Risk of Rain 2 because I think that some of the decisions in the game are just bad. I don't think I dislike them. I think they're objectively bad game design decisions. Obviously, I do dislike them. I'm just saying that further than that, I would predict that most players would prefer it if it was this way. And indeed, there's a mod for most of those things because other people agree that the thing is not so great. Some of the decisions are debatable. For example, in Risk of Rain 2, you can buy turrets, and they're pretty bad. And there's a mod that makes it so when you activate the teleporter on each stage, your turrets are all teleported to the teleporter. That is good and bad. It's kind of awkward. Sometimes it can be a little cheesy. Like on early stages, it can be your turrets will just mow down all the enemies that spawn after the boss. But you could argue that's good because you're rewarded for buying a lot of turrets. It's not the hugest benefit because you're often not spending that much money that you're going to get from killing those enemies easily, but it does keep you safer. Does that make turrets too strong? You could argue that. I don't think it does. I think turrets are virtually useless except then, so having something that makes them good that way, whatever. But teleporting the turrets to the teleporter is obviously not the only way to make them more powerful. And the developers, if they understood that players don't think turrets are any good, probably would choose a different way to make turrets stronger. I don't know what they would choose. You could speculate. Maybe turrets can move. Maybe they're way more tanky. Maybe they do a lot more damage or have way more range or something. Maybe they copy your items like engineers' turrets, etc. They might do any number of things that might be better or worse, but I think that it really depends on the game. This thing you say, like fan-made works, though, the developer's original intent can be buried under custom content. True buildcraft to me involves playing the game as close to form as possible. The reason I really bounce off that idea is that games are not designed as excellently as each other. I think Genshin Impact and Hades are masterfully designed games for the most part. They're not perfect, but there are very few things in those games that you can mount a real argument that the thing should be different. It's pretty clear why the thing is that way. There are elements in both games, Barbara in Genshin Impact and Chi-Chi as well, but also, for example, the resin system, and in Hades, things like there's that one Pact of Punishment modifier that really rewards fast-hitting weapons, but there isn't really a modifier that rewards slow-hitting weapons at higher heat levels. That's just not really fair or balanced. It's not ideal. Neither of these things really have a meaningful impact on either game being like not that good, but they are small things that you could target and say, okay, that's not ideal. But overall, these are games that are excellently designed. The people designing them are geniuses that have very carefully crafted this is where these things are going to be. By contrast, Warframe is not that way. The people who make Warframe are not stupid. They often have wonderful ideas. Warframe is a game that is a cornucopia of good ideas, but a lot of them are not well designed. They're not well implemented into a game. They focus too much, I think, on the cool idea. It's not that they focus too little or they don't know how if they focused on it more to balance the game better. It's that they don't consider that important or they don't focus on it for some reason. It's not because they're stupid necessarily, but it is a mistake, I think, a waste of potential to focus on that as little as they seem to. And so in Warframe, I would not agree that playing the game the way it's intended is somehow the truest buildcraft, because the game is, and I know this is going to sound absurd to say on its own, but in the context of this whole discussion, the game is wrong about some things. In Risk of Rain 2, the game is not just, you shouldn't assume the game is right about the way it's designed. I don't think you're saying we should do that, but I do think it's worth mentioning that for many games, the way you think about them can be much more fun if you just have a slightly or significantly different mindset about them. There are games that can be damaged or made worse by the player's mindset. Of course, that's common. But I do think, for example, in Risk of Rain 2, it's not like less true to playing Risk of Rain 2. That's not really buildcraft, but you get the point. To mod the game. I think some mods in Risk of Rain 2 nearly universally make the game more fun for people, and that doesn't make it less true to the game's design. That is an experience where the player and the modding community are more fully realizing the game's design intention. I think that Risk of Rain 2 is it features a sequence of choices for what you buy on a stage. And so if you make more of the things on the stage worth buying, I think that is directly congruent with the game's design intentions. That is, in a way, I would argue, a more true version of the game that the developers simply did not get to when they were developing it. That doesn't mean they're idiots. Game design is not perfect. Game design doesn't work like that. But the point is, I strongly disagree that most games, their true buildcraft involves playing the game as close to the way the game is intended to be played as possible. Not least of which because, to briefly touch on a different topic, Magic the Gathering, for example, is often played in a way motivated by financial incentive. For example, when Oko, Thief of Crowns, was in Standard, I think there is a very strong argument to be made that Standard environment was objectively better if you pretended Oko did not exist before they banned him. Just because the way it was meant to be played included this obviously overpowered card doesn't mean that was a better way to experience Magic. It was pretty much unarguably a worse way to experience Magic. And eventually the developers agreed and banned the card. I know you're kind of not saying it this way, but I definitely disagree that playing the game as close to form as possible is always, or even usually, more true buildcraft. In fact, I think it's more often than not at least slightly inferior. That being said about all of this, a very important topic I wanted to discuss in this long-ass video about this topic is the idea that most players are, in my opinion, bad architects. They're bad game designers, and giving them too much agency is usually not better than the pretty good job that most developers did. Warframe is a game that I think is rather average, if not a little worse than average, in its overall implementation of its very good game design ideas, but I would argue that 99% of players would be even worse than that. And so in that sense, I agree with you that it's good advice to say that players should play the game as is in general. But when you are the person who's the exception to the rule, if you maybe do this as a career, yeah, I mean, it's worth keeping in mind that, like, not to be full of myself, I can probably recommend good things for some games, being that it is literally my job to think about that topic. It's not impossible to improve on them. I just think most people wouldn't. So in that way, I guess I agree. I think you are good at that thing. Anyway, whatever. We'll move on to the last part. EyePatchNotes says, I similarly derive satisfaction from digging into the timeline of a game. Okay, interesting. This is a pretty different topic. How useful was a given piece of content at the time of its writing compared to now? Was the game design space properly filled out in the coming months or years? These questions are why I latch onto sequels. What did the developers identify as pillars versus the player base? Coming soon, players as archaeologists. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I take that point very well. For example, in Risk of Rain 2, the players modded in Bandit. I think a character from Risk of Rain 1. I haven't played Risk of Rain 1 yet. And the players modded in a very cool version of Bandit as a mod you could play. And the developers thought, that's a good idea for a character. Let's put that character back in. It sounds like they were initially going to, but then they didn't. And the players said, oh, but you totally should. And then they maybe saw that the mod was good and thought, yeah, that makes sense. Like, the players did kind of identify that in an interesting way. I will admit, at the end of this video, EyePatchNotes, I don't understand the pillars metaphor. I don't. I really don't know what you mean at all. I'm sure that's clear by now, but I hope that I talked about this in a way that had something to do with what you wanted. And if it didn't, please tell me and I will do one again. That has always been the policy with Parley. But to be honest with you, I've been talking about this for a long time and I've done 3 takes and I don't really know what you mean by that. I think I know what this general topic is about, but I'm really missing something with the idea that the individual things are, I don't know. I mean, there are sort of vectors of balance or consideration, but the pillars thing is really throwing me off. So I hope that I wasn't totally off topic. Yeah, one thing I find pretty interesting when thinking about a game's game design and understanding a game's game design is, you know, I'm often asked when a new Warframe update comes out, what do you think about this update? And I very frequently say, I don't know, because it just happened. And the things that would be good about implementing status changes aren't going to be good until balance is done with the numbers on those changes. In Warframe at the moment, status balance is pretty bad. It's not good. It doesn't make sense. There isn't really a reason to use most status effects. It's not a very meaningful choice almost all of the time. And even when it is, it's usually a pretty boring choice. Again, generally, if you have a given condition, there is one just be-all, end-all choice. And there are very few given conditions, so that's not good. But there are many changes that were made to what status effects do in Warframe that the idea behind the change could be a competitive option. It just currently isn't. So for example, Parazon finishers restoring resources to you could be good, but it currently isn't because you're not good enough at opening enemies to Parazon finishers enough of the time. The amount of stuff you get when you do a Parazon finisher is too low, and killing enemies is too often more efficient than slowing down to get more resources because it's too easy to get more resources most of the time. You just don't need what you get enough. If it was easier to open enemies to Parazon finishers, or maybe like you could do one after killing the enemy, provided you open them up to the finisher before killing them, and you got more from doing a Parazon finisher, then the idea would suddenly work. It's not because the idea is bad. It's because the number that determines how powerful the good idea is not a high enough number. And if that was changed, it would become better. So if you say, did you like status revised? Did you like those changes to impact? I don't know whether to say yes or no. The idea is clearly good. It could be a good thing in the game that makes sense. Do players ever stop what they're doing to restore energy? They do. So why not this? And it could weave into combat pretty nicely. It could give weapons that innately have impact damage more flavor. It's obviously got potential to be a very good idea. That's a very obvious in my opinion. And the problem is that it's just weak. It's the power level of the good thing is bad. So it's not currently good. But am I happy that update happened? You see what I'm struggling with here? I am, because the ideas were good, and if they change them later to actually be powerful ideas, then that would be really good. But if I take the update in isolation, which it never is, but on the day the update came out, the game was worse than it was the day before. So in that sense, I guess I hate the update. But if you could look in the future and know, oh, in a year and a half, they're going to rebalance these, I would say this is the beginning of a very good change for Warframe, which is different, you know? And I do think that's a very important aspect of understanding, as much as the developers think about what the players will do with the framework that they make, the players may benefit, often do benefit, but often don't think about the benefit of considering where the developers might be going with something. I'll give you a current example before we stop. In Warframe, Sentinel weapons are broadly not very powerful. They don't do a lot of damage. They can be useful, and there's virtually no cost to equipping them. You don't lose anything by using them, which is a good reason for them to not be too powerful, not for nothing. But it would hardly destroy the game if they were more powerful. They could be much more powerful, and as long as they were not like really, really powerful, it would be fine. It clearly would not destroy the game's balance, and players might be more excited to use them. So you can understand if the developers were to make a powerful Sentinel weapon, maybe that's what they're thinking. And they did make a powerful Sentinel weapon. They made the Verglis, which is literally the Glaxion, a weapon the player can use, stapled to your Sentinel. Several orders of magnitude more powerful, worlds more powerful than every other Sentinel weapon we currently have in terms of damage output, and it also has superior utility to some other Sentinel weapons as well, making it a dominant and pretty overpowered choice in its context right now. But if you view that decision as a way for the developers to begin phasing in more powerful Sentinel weapons, or to test how players would react if they added a more powerful Sentinel weapon, suddenly the decision makes a lot more sense. If you could look into the future and know they are going to add more powerful Sentinel weapons, the Verglis's problems virtually disappear, because the only bad thing about it really is that it makes the choice of a Sentinel weapon very boring. You had many choices, and now you have less choices. In that way, the game is worse with the Verglis than without it. But if later those choices are buffed, that version of the game would arguably be better. There would be choices just like before, and they'd be more powerful, which many players, but not all, would care about. And so that seems overall like an improvement, right? If the way to get from point A to point B is to put the Verglis in by itself, that probably makes sense, but we don't know if that's what they're doing. This is a case where my final takeaway here is that I think game developers and humans in general really ought to explain why they're doing things much more than they currently do. Why are you discussing this thing this way? Why did you nerf this thing? Not just because players are using it a lot. That's not a reason. You nerfed it because you know that players do have more fun if they have more options, whether they know they're having more fun that way or not. So why don't you explain that? Why don't you say that? Are you worried people won't be happy? They're already not happy. So it doesn't really make sense to not say that, in my opinion. And I feel like, broadly speaking, much of the difficulty in game design revolves around the developers refusing to simply explain why they chose to do a thing a certain way. And then maybe the player could make a more informed decision about whether they want the thing to be that way. Just because the developers have a reason for putting it that way doesn't mean you want it to be that way, but you might want to be aware, sure. And I think that that's valuable. I don't understand why. Well, I kind of understand why. People are lazy. And I think people are a little worried that people will take apart the reason they offer for the thing. Yes, but I don't agree that that is enough of a negative reason to outweigh the positive benefit of just explaining why you're doing what you're doing. I think that all over the place, not just in buildcraft, but game development and buildcraft are very good examples. It is deeply unhelpful when someone says a thing they're doing, but explicitly avoids talking about why. That's almost worse than if they didn't tell you, I think, a lot of the time, because it just makes you frustrated and it puts you in a guessing game where you're not sure what's going on. You can't go back to not knowing they did it intentionally, but you don't know why, and so you kind of have to be nervous. This problem plagues Warframe. Warframe is defined by this issue, in my opinion. And I think if we take anything from this topic, it's that players and developers collaborating to make a game should be a collaboration. Having it be more indirect and standoffish is not good for anyone. It doesn't benefit anyone. And I would argue that in this day and age of a lot of communication technology, it's probably not so difficult to be more clear with the players. So, very oversimplified advice, people should be. and people should explain things more. It brings me great joy whenever someone explains, like, this is why I'm doing this thing, or this is why this thing happened. I'm over the moon. Even the attempt is really good. That's great. Anyway, this was an insanely long parlay. I had a lot of fun. I thought it was really interesting, but I'm anxious that I just completely missed the point. So please tell me, at least EyePatchNotes will probably watch this whole thing, so thank you. I hope you had fun. I don't feel like I did a good job. I think this is bad and I'm considering deleting it, but I'm not going to. I'm going to do it and let you decide whether you think I got the thing right. I mean no blame when I say this, but it's very hard when I make Parley to parse apart, is this question maybe a little confusing because wording these things is hard? It's not your fault. I don't mean to accuse you at all. It just, it's not easy to word questions perfectly, right? And I often wonder, I'm often haunted by the question of whether I did a bad job understanding and or to what degree the person didn't make it as clear, or I would have benefited from directly talking to the person about what they meant. And in these cases, as I said before, I'm fine with speculating. The only concern for me, and the reason that I get shy about putting the thing up, is simply because I want to make sure you enjoyed the topic. I like that you put effort into this really interesting discussion, and I would hate for you to feel like I talked about it for an hour, but you didn't really get what you wanted, when if you could have just added one little thing, you could get the answer. And so in these cases, I'm going to make the possibly dangerous precedent statement that if you tell me that extra thing that would maybe make me understand, I will do another parlay of it. You don't have, I'm not going to charge you anything or whatever. If I'm off the mark, but it was close and you feel like you can clarify it quickly, I am very willing to try again. I like doing these. I'm not going to be upset if you say that. I'll be happy because I want to understand. The upset, the negative feeling that I have when I leave a parlay like this is simply that I had fun talking about the topic, but I fear that I didn't really understand, and I want to understand. I like to understand. So if that is happening, please tell me. And I really appreciate the extremely in-depth parlay questions as usual. Thank you very much.